Hi guys, welcome to this comparison video. Today I'm comparing two black dial Seikos from my collection. They're both automatic, they're both about 38mm. They are the Sarb033 and the SKX013. So these two watches came into my collection in very different ways. This SKX came from Australia. I think Caliber Chronicles was the guy who I bought it from. Gave me a really good fair price, I was very happy with it. And the Sarb actually came to me on trade. I traded the vintage Zenith for this and one other watch, which I was quite happy with. I wasn't expecting to own it anytime soon, but I'm quite happy that I do now. So first up, let's compare the case to these two watches. The Sarb is a 38mm diameter with 44.6mm lug to lug. The SKX also has a 38mm case, although it's important to note that it's often quoted as a 37mm case. This is actually the diameter of the bezel, not the case itself. The SKX also has a lug to lug of 44.3mm, very close to that of the Sarb. So these watches both have a pretty similar silhouette from the top. However, the proportions are very different for a number of reasons. First up, the SKX is a dive watch, so it's thicker than the Sarb. The SKX is 13.2mm thick, and the Sarb is 11.7mm thick. In the hand and on the wrist, this 1.5mm difference is surprisingly noticeable. Secondly, you may notice the Sarb looks like a larger watch, mostly due to its larger dial and slimmer bezel. The Sarb has a 31mm crystal, and the SKX only has a 27mm crystal. You might think that because of the larger dial, the Sarb would be more legible than the SKX. However, you have to remember the SKX is a dive watch. Therefore, it has thicker, more legible hands, and larger hour markers. The Sarb is more shiny, which in bright light can make it a little tricky to read. But in normal conditions, a high polish of the hands tends to make up for the lack of lume. This is a technique that Grand Seiko also uses in some of its fully luminous watches. While we're on the subject of lume, both these watches use Seiko's proprietary Lumibright material. Another key difference in these watches are their crowns. The Sarb has a signed crown at 3 o'clock, and the SKX obviously has its unsigned crown at 4. The casebacks for these watches are also different, although I think both have their merits. The SKX has a very utilitarian solid caseback with a wave motif. The Sarb on the other hand has an open caseback, which is really great for admiring its movement. Now the movements in these watches are both of course in-house Seiko calibers. The SKX, being the cheaper of the two watches at retail, uses the workhouse 7S26, which is simple automatic movement with day-to-day complication. The Sarb, being the more premium of the two watches, has a slightly superior 6R15 movement, which is also automatic, but adds features such as hand winding and hacking, and only displays the date, not the day of the week. The bracelets on both these watches have received criticism from some. However, as someone who likes to wear my watches fairly tight to my wrist, I've never been bothered by the rattling that other owners report. The Sarb's Oyster bracelet isn't the highest end I've ever experienced. However, again, wearing it tight doesn't bother me. As you would expect, the SKX has a much more flimsy Jubilee bracelet. It really flops about when you're not wearing it, but as I said, for me wearing it tight doesn't bother me at all. The SKX's clasp on the other hand is fairly cheap, and while it does its job and has a locking mechanism, it could be better. The micro adjustment is nice, however it's not quick use, and compared to the Sarb machine clasp, it does feel cheap sometimes. The Sarb's machine clasp, as I said, is quite nice quality. It has a 2-button release, and it does feel very secure on wrist without needing a lock. Now the design of these watches is obviously very different. Just looking at the dial and hands, you can tell that they are built for very different purposes. The Seiko Sarb, which actually tends to be the favourite among people I ask, is a hell of a lot dressier with a lot less lume than the SKX. It also has a better designed date window, as the date wheel is the same colour as the dial. The dial colours are also very different in person, with the Sarb having a more gloss black finish, and the SKX being closer to, although not a true matte. Personally, I prefer the design in the SKX013, although it may be less dressy. I think its rugged, tall appearance suits my lifestyle more, and its slightly smaller dial makes it wear smaller on my wrist, so it suits me more. I think it's also fair to say that the Sarb is a more showy watch. Because of its larger dial and highly polished surfaces, it can really catch the light, and this will draw more attention to your wrist than something like the SKX. Some more technical specs these watches don't have in common are firstly their crystals, with the SKX using Seiko's Heartlex crystal, which is a type of acrylic, and the Sarb using the more premium and expensive sapphire crystal. Another technical spec on these two watches are their water resistance. The SKX has a 200 meter water resistance as it's a dive watch, and the Sarb also has a fairly impressive 100 meter water resistance. This is a fair water resistance considering the Sarb doesn't have a screw down crown like the SKX does. You may have noticed throughout this video that some of the photos of my SKX013 have a silver bezel. This leads me on to the topic of watch modification. When you think about modified Seikos, more than likely you think about the SKX007, which is the 013's bigger brother. While the 007 does have the most aftermarket support, these two watches have some aftermarket parts, although at a much reduced volume and variety. The SKX is the most moddable of the two, with some Seiko 5 dials, hands, etc. being used on these watches, and also some bezels available such as my own. The Sarb on the other hand only really has two things available. Firstly, aftermarket bracelets are fairly widely available for this model, and secondly, fluted bezels can be found for this model. So given all these factors, it's my opinion that the SKX013 is the better of the two watches. Not only is it cheaper, it's also more rugged, more waterproof. It also fits my smaller 6.5 inch wrist just that little bit better. Let me know which of these two watches you would pick to have in your collection. I'm sure the Sarb will probably win out, but for those of us who love the SKX013, we know why it's great. So there's my video review / comparison on the Seiko Sarb and the Seiko SKX. Please tell me if you enjoyed it by commenting down below. Subscribe and like this video, and share it with any of your watch friends. We really want to grow this channel so more people can see our content.